entire thing and completely forgot. So first, welcome everyone to this evening's chat within the Nine-Sided Circle, brought to you by the Nine-Sided Circle, a subsidiary of No Such Tadika.
All right.
So I'm embarrassing Kyle again. She's sitting over there going, yeah, the old guy, he's rambling on. Forgot to give him his meds.
All right. So, misunderstandings of language.
Misunderstandings of language. So we're talking about the old saying, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, I first heard this when I was probably 5 or 6, and my mother had somehow forced me into church. She had found like the one Protestant church in all of eastern New Mexico, because all you used to have out there is Catholics, right? New Mexico was a very Catholic state. If you went to western New Mexico, you might find a few Mormons hiding out in the corners, but it was mostly Catholics. And so my mother, who was raised Lutheran because she was Swedish, always wanted me to be exposed to the Protestant faith. And so she drugged me to church, much against my will, because I had to do things like put on shoes. And there is nothing quite like putting on shoes when you're 5 to ruin your entire day. But I put up with it. And this lady who was teaching the Sunday school, another idea I didn't like, because I already did 5 days of school that week, and I was supposed to have time off. But Sunday, no, not such a good idea. So Sunday school. She told me this. She said, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I'm sitting there, and I know what a camel is. I saw one on TV once, right? And I know what a needle is because everybody around me knew how to sew. And I'm trying to figure out, how do you get this big old beast through the eye of a needle? And it never made sense to me. But later on, I figured out that it meant that it was impossible for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. But then, somewhere along the line, I found context. Now, first of all, you have to remember that this was said to a whole bunch of fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. So this was a metaphor that was given specifically not to seamstresses, not to the intelligentsia of Palestine, but to a bunch of fishermen. And then I found out that things were not as they seemed. So here's something I didn't know when I first heard this, that in Palestine, in the Sea of Galilee, on the ships, there was a kind of twine that was used for sewing sails and that sort of thing. And you know how we talk about tissues for wiping your nose, and no matter what brand they are, we call them Kleenex, right? Kleenex and nose tissues has become the same thing, even though Kleenex is one specific brand. So just as with that, this particular kind of twine that was spun from camel hair was called camel. So it's like, Ben Yeshua, cut me off about 5 cubits of camel, would you? Meaning, cut me some of this strand. And we are not talking about a size 14 Nicholson beading needle. We're talking about a 2,000-year-old sailmaker's needle, which means that the eye was about yay big around. And the thing is about yay long, and you didn't use a thimble to push it through. You used this big old hunk of leather on your palm to shove it through the sail. So, yeah, it's a little hard to get through the needle. But when you understand this, all of a sudden, that saying takes on a completely different context than what we were given to believe as impressionable young children in Sunday school. And it doesn't mean that it's impossible for a rich man to get into heaven. It just means, yeah, it's a little difficult. You have to like lick him once and then shove him through the eye of the needle. So this is a problem that happens with all translations, every single one of them, no matter whether they're contemporary or whether they're 1,000 years old. Earlier today, I was chatting across the interwebs with our friend Funny, who is of Swedish descent, and she deigns to speak to me in Swedish. And it's incredibly kind of her because my Swedish is so bad. And so I always like triple check it to make sure that I put everything together. And I oftentimes have to look up words and all of that sort of thing to remember everything. And then when I look at the sentence structure, I translate it into English, it often makes no sense. But yet she can understand exactly what I mean. And yes, she's smart, but it's actually because the way everything is structured makes sense in that language, doesn't make sense in English. So even with modern languages, you have this problem. So when we talk about things like souls within the work, that is a metaphor that's over 1,000 years old in a different language. In Arabic, we use the term ruh, R-U-H. For talking about the kind of souls that we're talking about. And you can translate ruh as soul or spirit or breath, interestingly enough. And so when we say, you must build a soul, that sounds really weird in English. But in its original context, it actually makes sense for the time, the place, and the people for which it was delivered. So, with that in mind, I'm going to talk about some weird stuff tonight. And I'm going to start with a quote from Mr. Gurdjieff. This is from Meetings with Remarkable Men. And it says, understanding is acquired, as I have already said, from the totality of information intentionally learned and from personal experiencings, whereas knowledge is only the automatic remembrance of words in a certain sequence. Let me read that again. Understanding is acquired, as I have already said, from the totality of information intentionally learned and from personal experiencings, whereas knowledge is only the automatic remembrance of words in a certain sequence. So here we're talking about two different things. You go to school and you don't really learn things oftentimes. You memorize so-called facts. When I was a kid, we all knew that Columbus sailed, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all knew that, right? And we all knew that Columbus discovered America. And it never explained how there were people here when Columbus discovered America. I mean, I guess they did not know where they were or something. You know, you go up and go, hi, where are we? And they look at, I don't know.
Nancy says,
yes.
Yudkowsky talked about guessing the teacher's password.
Yeah, we're kind of talking about that. It's not so much guessing the teacher's password as understanding the context that the teaching is given. And to do that, you have to know a whole bunch of stuff. And this is where Muslims have it over Christians, or theoretically anyway. Because I was taught when I was studying the Quran that you cannot understand what you're reading unless you understand the context in which the message was given, the people to whom it was given, and the people who it referred to. And that means that the idea that a lot of preachers I've run across like to do of taking one line out of an entire chapter and quoting it so that it means what they want it to mean, theoretically, you're not supposed to do that.
Mm.
And so this teaching, though it has been forgotten more than I would like, is a very important part of understanding any text or any teaching. When was it given? Where was it given? To whom was it given? In what context was the teaching meaningful? So I'm going to reintroduce two terms. I've talked about this before, but I'm old, so I get to repeat myself.
Of course.
Of course. So the two words are afak and anfus. These are two Arabic words, and they traditionally are referred to as worlds. But again, this is a metaphor. This is how people talked in metaphor to describe a particular experience. So, afak means horizon or view, and in the sense that in this sense, it refers to the phenomenal world. It is that which is given to the senses to perceive from reality. Afak is limited to the constraints of the senses. It is only what is perceived with the senses without the internal window dressings that we like to put on. Anfus comes from the root nun fi sin, which is where we get the word nafs, which means ego or self. Anfus is the internally constructed world that is made up of memory, habit, conditioning, learning, and things like that. Also imprinting and that sort of thing. Anfus is the veil through which we see life. It projects the stories that we carry around within ourselves onto the afak, onto the world that is as it is given. So we have those two ideas. And usually you never quite ever get to the afak, to being able to describe the world or experience the world as it is without the stories. It is a very high state of consciousness, they say, when you can do that. Because most of the stories in the anfus exist slightly below the level of consciousness. You don't notice that you're telling yourself these stories. So,
Any questions so far? Because that's, this is a lot. I think Nancy might be typing.
go for it, Nancy. Oh, by the way, Aaron sent a note, said he's sorry that he can't be here tonight, but he got invited out to a movie with friends and it was just too good to pass up.
Oh, we'll miss him, but I'm glad
Yeah.
he's doing something fun. Not that we're not fun or anything, you know.
We're fun, but we're probably not as fun as maybe Captain Marvel.
True.
Captain Marvel is supposed to be quite fun. Nancy asks, where does science fit into the Afak Anfus dichotomy? Um, it depends on how you do your science. If you're doing your science correctly, what you are trying to do is to describe the Afak, the world as it is given. Unfortunately, egos tend to drift in, and oftentimes you get that internal overlay in your scientific inquiry. But here's something that most people don't realize. Did you know that investigation, the scientific method, was actually originally developed by Muslim scholars in the Islamic Golden Age? That's where it started. And it was created as a way of addressing just this problem, the problem of objectivity versus subjectivity. So science should be, what were they doing? Well, let me see. They were discovering the secrets of optics, of astronomy, of geometry, of geography, metallurgy. Basically, all of the sciences that made the Western world great were being discovered around 1,000 years ago in the Islamic Golden Age. A lot of it they were copying from India and China, because the Prophet Muhammad said, travel even unto China for knowledge. So this is where you get uh, if you remember your history of medicine, for instance, you've heard about Avencia. People talk about this dude Avencia who wrote a book. They fail to mention that that's just a European corruption of the name Abu Sina, who basically created modern medicine.
Nancy, Tom says, no, I never heard that. I thought it was the Greeks. Okay, that makes sense. India and China. And plus, didn't they preserve?
Oh yeah, the Islamic world preserved the texts of the Greeks. During the Dark Ages, Europe lost all of the Greek philosophers. They didn't start getting them back till around 1492 with the reconquest of Spain, when they got all of the libraries of Cordoba, which contained Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and most of the great Greek texts, all the mathematics and everything. And they had some Jewish people who they were, threatening to burn at the stake or kick out. But before they got rid of them, they forced them to translate all of this stuff from Arabic into Latin. I'm glossing over some details, but that's basically it.
Nancy asks, is there a book you recommend about this?
I can look up some books. The other thing, though, and I have to also point this out, is that at the same time that the Muslim Renaissance was going on, the Jewish Renaissance had been going on for several hundred years, and you get great Jewish scholars like Maimonides, who had as much to do with creating Western medicine as the Arabs did. Yep. Somebody who was just mentioning Maimonides. Yes.
You,
yeah. Yeah. People do not realize that Maimonides was recognized as a Sufi by Sufis, even though he was Jewish. They were like, we don't care if you're Jewish. You're just that cool. We're going to claim you. Yeah, so wakey.
Questions? I know, I'm trying my best. So, Anfus and
Afak.
Afak.
So the prophet said, man is asleep. He will not awaken until death. And the prophet also said, die before you die. I believe these two sayings must be taken together to really understand what they mean. But before I start pontificating and sermonizing, sermonizing, yes, I do one. I like to sermonize. Anybody care to hazard some ideas about these two sayings? What do you think it means? Man is asleep. He will not wake up until death.
Yeah, it means that we live in a dream. I mean, we're dreaming. We're dreaming
Yes.
that we are awake. Yes.
Yes.
So, but death will awaken us to the absolute fact or to the true meaning of this life. But everything is an illusion. So.
Yeah, if what I say about the afak and the anfus is true, then we are living in a kind of dream. We're projecting that dream onto reality constantly. Now, there is a Sufi concept called the insan al-kamil, the perfected human being, or the awakened human being. And one could say that what this awakening is giving up that dream. So, you can do that by dying. Death has a certain sort of reality to it. You know, you can't do take-backs. But the prophet also said, die before you die. And I suggest to you that he is saying that there is a way to experience the for lack of a better term at the moment, ego death, and experience the world as it is without the dream in this lifetime.
Yeah, Nancy says, it is possible to wake before literal death if you are willing to accept a great change.
Yes. Yeah, basically everything has to change. Everything has to change. I remind you of a story from Meetings with Remarkable Men, one of my favorites because I love the line in it. Gurdjieff goes to the dervish Boga Edin and says to him, I have been practicing breathing. I inhale and then I retain my breath for a while and then I exhale. What is your opinion of this? And the dervish says, may God kill those who presume to teach yet do not themselves know. That's like, whoa. And then he goes on to say, you must change everything or change nothing. You cannot just take one little bit and change it because it's a whole system. I'm paraphrasing here again. And this is one of the axioms of the particular path that I was taught, that you must transform the entire being. There is no part of you as an egoic being that you get to keep. And this is very, very hard.
Scary.
Because, yes, we love our shit. And that is the death before death. Now, I said about this, I wrote something about this, which I'm going to read you because that way I don't have to make it up again. Obviously, the sleep that the prophet, upon whom be peace, is referring to here is not the sleep we have at night in our beds, though it may include that. I would like to suggest that the sleep that is referred to here is something rather specific, and freeing oneself from this sleep is central to the process of transformation that leads to the insan ikamal. Unfortunately, I have to slip at times into the realm of metaphor in an attempt to describe my understanding of what happens here. So please bear with me. The English language is sometimes short on words that accurately describe what is being talked about for things Sufic. So I will endeavor to point at the moon through metaphor and simile while building a vocabulary of traditional technical terms in Arabic for the most part that has been the language that Sufis have used for most of the last 1400 years to communicate these ideas. It has been suggested by experts and Sufis and plumbers and others that each of these parts of a person, the nafs or ego, the dat or essence, the various souls, the body, has its appropriate food. Without sufficient amounts of the right type of food, and food is in quotes here, I hope you can hear me say the quotes. Yeah, thank you. A given part cannot generate enough energy to develop. And if that part lags behind, the person as a whole is stunted. My understanding is that a person's dat, essential self, needs a very particular stimulus in order to grow. Unfortunately, the kind of sensory stimulus needed is short-circuited by the nafs or ego when it is in the amara, commanding phase. This being the case, the essential self stays, in most people, in an embryonic state. The nafs, ego, in its unrepaired state, functions by stealing attention. Attention, which is the rightful material of the essence, is fixated upon the objects of anfus. This fixation of attention follows a pattern of crystallization around core objects, which I suspect may be what Mr. Gurdjieff was talking about with his idea of the chief teacher. The nafs uses this pattern of fixation to set up the criteria for making a heuristic matrix of choice. When a person operates at this level of consciousness, for lack of a better term, they tend to react to people and events that have only one or 2 points of similarity to the objects of the heuristic matrix, as if 1 or 2 points of similarity made them identical to the anfus object in its entirety. You all understand what a heuristic is? Show of hands. Who does not know what a heuristic is?
No, says Tom.
Okay. A heuristic is it's a fancy philosopher's term for rule of thumb. So I'll give you a heuristic. Red touches yellow, kill a fellow. Red touches black, friend to Jack. What am I describing? I learned this heuristic when I was probably 5 years old, and I still remember it.
Tom says thank you. And Nancy mentions, oh yeah, a coral snake versus a corn snake. Yeah.
Coral snake versus a king snake versus the banded king snake.
Yeah.
They both have red, yellow, and black bands, but they are arranged in different sequence. If you pick up a banded king snake, it's fine. They're friendly snakes. If you pick up a coral snake and he bites you, they're a member of the cobra family. Their venom is a little on the potent side, and you are in for a very, very rough time at best. Or you find out how to die when you die.
So remember I told you about that snake dream?
Yeah.
It was definitely one of those. Yeah. I mean, the floor was just littered with those coral snakes. I know they're water snakes, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, Dave, you got to show off.
Yeah.
The most poisonous snakes in the world. Everything in Australia is poisonous. Spiders. And do not forget the world's only venomous mammal.
Platypus?
The platypus. The male platypus has modified dew claws on its rear legs that inject venom.
Those damn platypuses.
I am pretty sure that God was smoking something really interesting when he invented platypuses. It's like all these leftover parts. What shall we do with them? But you know, I spent like a month in Australia and I didn't die once. So I guess it's probably okay.
Tom says, time enough alone and weirdness evolves. Yeah.
Yes. So let us look at some of the things that I wrote there. I wrote that back in like 1984, 85. God, that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah, I guess. Well, Nancy says pattern matching.
Yeah, pattern matching is a way of doing heuristics.
Yeah. There are people who bring up movies when they're presented with an idea about the world, as though movies are evidence about how things work. Yeah.
Yep.
Dave says I was 2, and I'm not sure what that is related to.
In 1985.
Yeah.
Yeah. $1985. That was a very good year.
Was it? I wouldn't know.
That's right. You weren't even around, youngin'.
I was being discussed, likely.
Well, it all worked out, and here you are.
It all worked out, yep.
So, let's talk about the idea that each of the parts of a person, now I listed several parts. Nafs, we've talked about nafs. Nafs is the mechanical ego in the way that I'm using the term now. Nafs can mean a lot of things. Nafs is, it can actually be used in the same way that you use the word ruh, because they both mean breath, they can both mean soul. That, which is spelled either Z-A-T or D-H-A-T, depending on which kind of Arabic you are using. It means essence, the essential self. And I mentioned various souls and the body. So what am I talking about with various souls? I'll give you a hint. It is most probably also metaphor. Any thoughts before I go rambling on?
Dave offers the higher centers?
To a certain extent. I'm going to mention 4 souls. These are, starting from the bottom, it's not really the bottom. Which dialects of Arabic are common in these discussions? Well, we do classical Arabic because that's what I studied. And I can guarantee you, I know more ways to mispronounce words in classical Arabic than 90% of the people out there. We do Egyptian Arabic because that is what Ahmed and Rania speak, and I rely upon them oftentimes to make sure my definitions are clear.
Yeah.
And then sometimes we use Persian, and sometimes we use Turkish because my tradition was developed in Turkey and around the Turkish language. But Persian and Turkish both have huge numbers of Arabic loan words because of the uniting influence of the Arabic language upon the entirety of the Muslim world.
Tom asked about Farsi and Turkic.
Farsi and Turkic. What about Farsi and Turkic? Yes, we use Farsi words sometimes, and we use Turkish words a lot.
Yeah, like French is English, yes.
Yeah, or even more like Latin is in English, because for centuries Latin was the clerical language of the Christian church. And to this day, Arabic is the clerical language of Islam. And it's nice because you can go to any Muslim country in the world, and if you speak Arabic, there will be somebody you can talk to. It is Sufism came from the Middle East. It originated in Arabia, spread out in all directions. By about 1000 AD, it had really taken root in Turkey, or what we now call Turkey, and Central Asia, Turkmenistan, places like that, places like Bukhara and Samarkand. But you will find Sufism from China all the way across into the Balkans, through Turkey, all the way up through the Levant and the Arab countries of the Middle East, across North Africa, down through East Africa, down through West Africa, and into India and Malaysia, Indonesia. We get around. We like to travel.
Yeah. Tom says, I misunderstood then. Which tradition did you mean when you said yours came from Turkey?
That's the tradition in which I study.
So
that's what I like to call no such tariqah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my line of teachers, you trace them back from me to not just Turkey, but to Turkey and then to Bukhara, which is in Central Asia. And then from there down into Iran, and from Iran into Iraq, and from Iraq into Arabia. But most of the most important teachings that exist in my tariqah were given in Turkish or Arabic. So we're digressing a little bit, but that's okay because we like the history of Sufism. But if you look through the public talks, I did an entire hour and a half on my tradition and Kyle's tradition, our tradition.
Our tradition, that's
our
great.
Tradition, yes.
So if you want a more in-depth discussion, it might be good to look back.
Yeah, just look that up. It's in the list of, you go through the 9-sided circle forum and you'll find it. If not, ask me and I will find it for you.
So there you go. Okay.
Yeah. So the 4 souls.
Yep.
The first soul is called Jismani Ruh, which is the corporal soul. This is actually the body. Your body is considered one of your souls. The second is called the Serani Uru, and it means the moving soul. And this would be the bioelectric field that penetrates and surrounds your entire body. Right now, your body produces energy in the form of bioelectric impulses, which are nerve impulses, brain waves, and they can be measured. That second level of soul is this. The third level of soul is called the Sultani Uru, and that means the authoritative soul. Now, this is, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that what this is talking about here is developing the ability to produce a certain quality of brainwave that is not common to waking human beings, is usually only seen in sleep. And it's what we call gamma waves. Gamma waves go from like 25 hertz to all the way up to 100 hertz, but usually sit around 40 hertz. At first, back in the bad old days, people considered this sort of an artifact or leftover brain waves that would just fire off in the brain. But what we discovered when we started doing things like putting EEGs onto master level Tibetan monks as they meditate is that these guys are producing huge amounts of gamma waves in their brains. And as they're doing that, they're experiencing these states of oneness and integration of consciousness. It seems that when we, as regular human beings, experience this in sleep, what our brain is doing is integrating everything that we've learned that day. And so when one begins to develop the Sultani Ruh, the authoritative soul, one is learning to express this brainwave phenomena. That's my theory as to what they're talking about. And I have a lot of reasons for believing that this is actually the case, but not enough time to go through it all tonight. And then the last is the Ruhani Ruh, which is it's the soul. And this is and when I say soul, every time I'm saying soul here, I'm saying it in quotes, just so that we can be clear. The Ruhani Ruh is an integration of all of the levels of body, mind, and spirit of the physicality, of the bioelectric field, of the brain waves, all of this mediated through breath practice, through advanced pranayama. And so each of these has its own food. So, anybody care to take a guess on what the food of the physical soul is? Dave?
Well, it's got to eat something, so there's that. But also, I would say impressions of a physical nature, mapping in the patterns of the physical body, getting sensory motor amnesia out of the body, that type of thing.
Yes. The food that you feed your body, besides, I mean, yes, you have to eat stuff to fuel your body. But what your body craves is to be free of sediment. And that means Sensory motor amnesia is a term that is really quite brilliant, because as we go along, we forget parts of our body, how to move our body, all of these things. And when you are brought back to these places where you have sensory motor amnesia, it's like a revelation. Your body needs this. And if it doesn't get it, it is very, very hard for you to develop the other things. Not impossible. I'm convinced that a quadriplegic is just as capable of full awakening as anybody else, but they have certain limitations. It's a lot easier if you have a body to work with. So the first soul that you have to feed is your corporal soul, your body soul, and you have to feed it not just with good food, you also have to feed it with no food. Here's a paradox. The Prophet Muhammad said, for everything there is a medicine, and the medicine for the body is fasting. The medicine for the soul is fasting.
So I just want to interject quickly. Tom
Yes.
says, so you're saying motion is the food of the soul?
I'm saying motion is part of the food of the soul. Impression is also part of the food of the physical soul. To completely be embodied is the business of the Jismani Ruh. And the more so you are, the more essential energy you produce for your work. And that's work with a capital W. So, anybody care to have hazard a guess of what the food for the second soul would be? The bioelectric energy permeating the body and surrounding it.
Nancy
Friendly auras.
Friendly auras?
Oh, maybe. Yeah.
Spiritual performance or praying and stuff like that.
Yeah, that can be. Each of those will produce something. So when we look at energy as a waveform, and you get waveforms in your body, lots and lots of different ones, you have two things going on. You have frequency and amplitude. Frequency is the number of times you have a peak and a trough in between 2 points. Amplitude is how high and low those peaks and troughs are from the midline. Each of those has a different effect. Amplitude has to do with the power of the wave. The greater the amplitude, the greater the power. Frequency has to do with a lot of different things, more than we can get into tonight. So, there are ways to produce stronger amplitudes of your bioelectric energy. And Ronnie has mentioned a few. There are some spiritual practices that seem to be designed specifically to do this.
Dave mentions breath and the digestion of emotions.
Yeah, that's something that Mr. Gurdjieff talks about as one of the shocks. And that would probably have a lot to do with this. If you are running a lot of excess emotion, and the key word here is excess, so that your attention is focused on an emotional story within your own head, you are bleeding off a lot of this bioelectric energy. So if you stop doing that, the amplitude of your entire electrical field will tend to strengthen. You want the field to strengthen because if the field goes away, you're dead. And not before you die.
Just dead.
Just dead. Now, for the Sultaniru, there are specific forms of meditation practice that develop this state. And as I mentioned, the Tibetans seem to be really good at this, but they're not the only ones. There are Sufi meditations, there are Hindu meditations that all work to create this this cascade of brain waves that basically runs through your entire brain at this very high frequency. And so meditation is the food for the third soul. Up, down, large, small, dense, diffuse, in, out, pitching, swaying, heaving. And the last food for the last soul, the soul of souls, is your breath practice. Is very specific kinds of breath practice. So, any more thoughts or questions?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
In the teachings of Ibn Arabi and Naraqi, there is a book called Jami' al-Sa'adat, the collective happiness, something like this.
Yes.
Yeah, they both mentioned that there are 4 forces that controls us: the ghadabiyya, which is the anger force, the shahwaniyya, which is the lust force, and the mental force, and the illusion force.
Okay.
There are 4 forces, and the alignment, I mean, the brain or the mental force is the force that aligns the other 3. So how can we understand this in light of the other 4 levels of nafs that you mentioned?
Well, the levels of nafs, there are actually 7 in the levels of nafs. This is the levels of ruh, so it's slightly different. And I think that's maybe next week we're going to look at the 7 levels of nafs, the 7 levels of the ego. But what that sounds like is a little bit like traditional Unani medicine that works with the humors, because you sound like each of those is describing one of the humors. And I know that I've read at least parts of Iraqi's book, but it was like decades ago, and I'm not bringing it to mind. I didn't say that the nafs tends to not get the food that it needs. I said the nafs tends to steal food from everything, steal the energy of all of the other things.
Okay, but is it that it needs some attention, but not as much as it's taking?
Every part of you needs the right food. And the food for nafs is something that most people never really experience because the nafs does not get it until it quiets. You get to a place called the nafs at rest. And when the nafs is at rest, then it is getting its proper food, which is impressions from the environment. And it's specifically impressions from the external environment. But because it is pulling energy from everywhere, it's getting impressions from all of the other foods. Does that make sense?
I think so. So it's supposed to be receptive, and it's transmitting.
It's supposed to be receptive in a specific way. The business of the nafs is to keep your body alive. Nafs is part of the jismani ruh. It's part of the physical self. And it is that which keeps your heart beating, keeps your breath moving, and it keeps you environmentally aware so you don't do things like walk into walls or off cliffs. That's its job. Its job is to keep your body alive and functioning. Your ego is a lot like a science fiction horror story where you have this artificial intelligence that decides that the best way to, it gets a program, you know, one of these things that says you must protect human beings. That's your prime directive. Keep human beings safe. So it decides that the best way to keep human beings safe, to keep you as a human being safe, is to keep you entirely imprisoned and control your entire life, running off of its own heuristics.
Can I ask something?
Yes, of course.
I'm not sure if it will be related to what you're saying, but I don't know why I have this feeling about it, especially when you mentioned about the nafs and how it is made of waves and electromagnetic waves and energy and stuff like that. You know, I studied Reiki, but I did not continue till the end because when we were studying it, when I was studying it, the teacher mentioned about that there are other living organisms or thing, you know, there are other creatures living among us, and you can pick these energies, and when you meditate enough or when you reach a certain level, you can be able to communicate and see these creatures. And he mentioned that there are some people who can do that, like Ibn Arabi, for example, and this is why he could see the future or communicate with people who were not alive at the time or were not at the same place with him, but he had some sort of communications with them. So I wanted to ask you your thoughts about this, especially that you have mentioned about the nafs and how...
Okay, here's my first thought. Reiki strikes me as something that has no efficacy or value. it strikes me as a way to be able to put the word master behind your name if you really are into those sorts of things. I have never seen it do anything, first of all. Second of all, we know it is an article of faith that there are unseen beings, angels and jinn, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yes, there are angels and jinn. What does everybody tell you about bothering jinn?
Don't do it.
Exactly. Don't do it. Do not even pay attention to it. Yes, there are things out there. There are in Egypt right now crocodiles. Don't bother them, because if you bother them, they will eat you. It's the same with unseen things. I think that it is very, very dangerous to go around looking to communicate with unseen spirits of any form, because most of the time you're just talking to yourself wearing different costumes. And occasionally, if you're really, really unlucky, you might be talking to something other than yourself, and that never turns out well. And if the angels want to talk to you, they'll look you up. So that's my opinion of this, which is admittedly biased and what's the word I'm looking for? Opinionated.
He has very strong opinions about Reiki. Yeah.
Yes. So that's my thoughts on it.
I didn't continue actually because I started to feel strange things, and
yeah, I have enough trouble dealing with people that I wouldn't want to try and add more into it. People and jinn. One of my teachers could talk to jinn, and it was a pain in the ass.
I know.
And
I didn't know it was part of the package, by the way.
Yeah, it's usually not, and this is a good thing. I knew a Silat teacher. So years ago, I had a Silat school in Northern California with a friend. Yes, Tom is absolutely correct. Do not go out and make deals with the Fae. It never turns out well. So me and my partner are just closing up the school for the night, and then somebody knocks on our door, and we look out, and there's this dude, and he comes in, and he introduces himself, and we've heard of him, and he says, I wanted to show you my Silat. And he starts talking, and he says, I learned my Silat from the jinn. And he's talking to the jinn, right? He's talking up there, and he's asking them questions about what he should be telling us, and then he's telling us, and he's having these two conversations. Now, remember, I spent years working in psychiatric wards. That's how I put myself through school. I'm used to people who talk to people who I can't see. And this was qualitatively different than that. He was being ridden by something. And it didn't feel like psychosis. It didn't feel like schizophrenia. It wasn't him hearing voices. He was actually talking to something. And his Silat was really interesting. And he scared the crap out of me because he was crazier than a pet coon. He was totally out of his mind, whatever it was that was teaching him, so-called teaching him. And he would say, this knife technique, there are 15 ways to do this technique, 12 of which can be done by humans. And the other 3 can only be done by jinn. And he would demonstrate the 12, and they were interesting. But the price that he paid for this knowledge was like way, way, way too high. So, we got rid of him really fast. Like, oh, thank you for showing this. We have to go now. You just head right out the door. We locked up the door. We purified the entire studio. We were like burning cedar and doing all of the stuff we knew to get bad vibes out of it because it was just that creepy. So.
Yeah, Nancy says that was a good story. I didn't know that story, so that was interesting.
There's one or two things you don't know about me yet.
Yeah, some secrets left. Yes. All right, so Nancy says, well, I just wanted to actually touch on a comment from Dave. I answered it, but I don't want to just ignore it. So Dave asked, impressions from the environment minus a few filters. He was talking about the food for the nafs.
Yes. Minus all the filters you can get rid of. Impressions the afak rather than the
if you do this and if you start to work on the other ruh at the same time, it starts to produce a different type of feedback, a very positive one that produces.
Yes. So though I tend to recommend that you work one at a time. You start with just the physical. And you keep doing the physical, then you add the bioelectric, then you add the meditative, then you add the really heavy breath work. Then you're doing all four at the same time. But I like to ladder it up. And it is most efficacious when you start with the physical.
Right. If you are doing, let's say you have a couple of extra things working and you're doing the same physical practice as you used to, it will deepen, will it not? And then the food on the physical level will be different because there's less buffering in the system, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
You know, I just realized that I did it again, Kyle. Because we were talking before I started the video, I had the video pinned on you, so you're going to be in a lot of this video.
No, it's going to be me yawning and stretching and
and looking cute as a button.
Whatever. All right, so
okay, show of hands. Who would rather look at Kyle and who would rather look at me? Show of hands.
No, shut up.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I have rectified this.
So, quickly, Tom asked, what became of that guy? Did you ever see that?
He was, I don't know what became of him in the end, but, you know, I would hear about him from time to time. He was running around Santa Cruz, San Jose, San Francisco for a long time. And he was well known in certain of the martial arts communities. He was a good martial artist, and he was completely batshit crazy.
Woof.
Yeah.
And Nancy says, I've gotten some good results from Reiki, but there are a lot of different lineages. Yeah, I think that might have quite a bit to do with it too.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, people's mileage will vary.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Anything else? I don't think I missed any other comments.
All right. Last comments then. Last questions, last thoughts.
Did we cover everything we wanted to cover?
I think so. We've been running for an hour and 18 minutes.
Yeah.
And we will cover more. I think next week we're going to look at the 7 levels of the nafs.
Cool.
Goodbye, Dave. Thank you for coming.
Good to see you. See you
All
next
right,
week.
I'm going to stop the camera.